Welcome, internet friends, to Subscriber Storytime number 16. Only a couple of things to say this week. First, a lot of you ask if I'm taking submissions for Storytime. The answer is yes. Always, unless I say otherwise. Only at subscriberstorytime@gmail.com. And over the lifetime of this series, I've gotten around 2,000 entries, so if you haven't seen yours yet, yeah. I do read every submission email, however, so thank you all for sharing your stories with me, and as always, thank you all for your support of this series. I have a lot of fun not only reading your submissions, but voicing them as well. It's sort of like a cathartic thing for me. I don't know why. On to the stories. We have 7 of them today, but don't be alarmed, they're all quite lengthy, so I hope you all sit back, turn down the lights, and enjoy. This story begins in late 2009. I was in middle school and lived in Switzerland at the time. Now, the school I went to was a very fancy one. Lots of rich kids, a lot of whom were spoiled brats, but the school was nice, and the teachers were really good at their jobs. Normally, it would cost a fortune to study there, but since we moved there for my father's job, said job paid for my education. Now, at this school, each year, every class had a field trip. Our class got to go to Spain, more specifically Granada. The day we arrived went well enough. Our hotel was an old building with a closed-off pool and a red carpet floor. It looked like something out of the 30s. Other than that, however, there didn't appear to be anything wrong. We were grouped by rooms and settled into said rooms, and the next day we went to see the Alhambra, and again, the day went fairly well. However, that would all change that evening. There were 3 of us in my room. The beds were set up so that the 2 main beds were next to each other, and the third one, which was mine, was vertical to the foot of the other beds. When I laid down, my head pointed towards the window, which was closed and covered by fancy silk curtains. So here comes the reason for sharing my story. That evening, it was lights out at 11 p.m. Despite this, my roommates had brought over 3 people from another room to play card games. Now, I was a goody two-shoes back then, so naturally, when 11 p.m. came and they refused to end the card game, I ratted them out. Lame, I know, but that was just me back then. So, finally we get to bed and turn off the lights. I try to get some sleep when, all of a sudden, I feel what is almost like a hand stroking my cheek. It didn't feel like a real one, though. The best word to describe it is ethereal. Naturally, I assumed my roommates were playing a revenge prank on me. I asked them, and they claimed to know nothing. I buy their story and give them the benefit of the doubt. I returned to sleep, but listened for footsteps, just in case they tried again. Suddenly, there was the sensation of a hand again. A terrible thought came over me. What if it actually wasn't them? I checked the curtains, thinking they might be the culprit, but they were way too far away from my face. I once again brush it off and try to tell myself it was just the result of me being half asleep or something. What happened next is something that stayed with me to this day. Once more, I felt the hand on my face, but this time it was accompanied by an eerie combination of whispering and a woman singing softly without words. It's hard to explain what it was like, but to give something to compare it to, in the game World of Warcraft, once you die, there is an angel that makes a very creepy whisper. It was like that, but softer. Terror struck me as I was hit by the realization that it wasn't a prank nor the curtains. I wasn't sure what it was, but it was something else. I screamed so loud that the entire floor heard me, I was later told. My PE teacher burst through the door and asked what was wrong. I just sat there, almost frozen from terror, and explained everything. He told me to go back to sleep. After all this happened, I slept peacefully, and this encounter wasn't repeated. I think whatever it was got scared off by my screaming. People have said all sorts of things. It must have been a bug, or it was just your imagination. I, however, know what I experienced, and I know that whatever happened that night, it was anything but my imagination. It still haunts me to this day. My story revolves around my 1997 Buick Skylark. That may sound oddly specific, but it's vital to my experience. In the fall of 2016, I started college. The university I attend is only a 30-minute drive from where I live, so my newly purchased hand-me-down vehicle and I became well acquainted. I consider myself a creature of habit, and one of my favorite rituals was gas day. I made sure to wake up a good 10 minutes earlier on Mondays so I could pop over to my local Get-Go for gas. I'd pull in around 6:50 in the morning, and not a lot of people were awake then, but I liked having the gas station to myself. I could appreciate the chill starting to weave itself into the wind, and settled myself into a thick sweater that was never more appropriate. I was a bit naive, I suppose. I felt safe in my routine. One morning I woke up and it was gas day, but something kept me from getting up. There was an invisible barrier that set me on edge. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it sat in my belly, writhing around like snakes in a pit. When I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, the feeling amplified. I was vibrating on the inside, and something told me not to leave. Something told me to turn around and go back inside. Thinking this was the onset of a panic attack, I talked myself down until I felt the unease downgrade into silent paranoia. When I got on the road, the feeling disappeared. I couldn't wrap my brain around what had happened. I kept it in the back of my mind as I approached the gas station. I pulled up to my usual pump, bent down to pop my gas tank, and when I lifted my head, I saw a black car with heavy tinted windows had appeared beside me. I was revisited with the same horrifying feeling I woke up with. I could feel my pulse throbbing, but I still opened my door. I stepped out and made my way to the pump itself. The car was to my left, the pump on my right. From behind me, I heard a window rolling down. "Hey," a man said. "You need help with that?" My stomach dropped. "Hey," he repeated. "Do you need some help?" I managed to reply with a quick, "No thank you," as I shoved the nozzle into my tank. I could see him smile from the corner of my eye, and he stared at me, grin plastered to his face before rolling up his window and pulling around slowly. At this point, my body had surpassed fight or flight. I may rip this man in half if he gets out of his car. When he drives around to the other side of the pump I'm using and rolls down his window again, I start cataloging information. He's large, with close-shaven facial hair and a similar haircut. There's a cross on his forearm. I realize I am alone with this man. He speaks again, comfortable and smooth, almost practiced. "What's your name?" My mind races and I panic again. "Caitlin," I lie. "Nice to meet you, Caitlin. I'm John." He stared at me the way hunters stare at mounted animal heads on walls. "Where are you off to this morning? Going to school?" "Yes," I say, "just getting gas." "I like your car. It's pretty old. You know, I own a dealership." He's staring at my car, analyzing it. He goes on to tell me how beautiful I am, how I shouldn't be out so early. I make as little conversation as I can, only answering him when absolutely necessary. When I hang up the nozzle, he asks for my number. I stand dumbfounded. I tell him I don't have anything to write on, but he pulls out a legal pad and pen. He's prepared. He does this often. He waves me toward his car. I want to cry. I want to get in my car and speed away, but I'm trapped. "I don't bite." Of course you don't, I think. I take the pad from the open window, scribble down a mess of numbers, and scurry away. He shouts that he'll be in touch before watching me hurry to my car and drive away. I don't go to class that day and instead return home, hiding under the blankets, feeling vulnerable. After a few days, I forget about it. I resume my usual routine and go about life until one night when I'm leaving my house for a quick trip to Walmart with my niece. She and I walk to my car when I see a man peer from around the corner of my neighbor's house. I freeze in fear, only to realize it is, in fact, my neighbor. He approaches me, gesturing for me to come forward. I tell my niece to wait in the car and jog toward him, his expression grim. In a hushed voice, he asks if I've seen anyone outside. I tell him I haven't, and he nods in a strange way. I saw a man in your driveway. He was big, looking at your car. I came outside and he ran off. Just thought you should know. 1,000 dots connect in an instant. Large man, car dealership. We'll be in touch. I burst into tears and tell him what happened a few days prior. He goes white as he listens and urges me to be careful and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. After my neighbor and I talked, I felt safer. Nothing ever happened after that, but I knew those events were inexplicably linked to one another. I stopped going to the gas station in the mornings, in case you were wondering. My name is Britt, and I grew up in a paranormally charged area. I was raised in a rural part of the eastern shore of Maryland. The land I lived on, up until I was 18, was once native land, and every time someone is stupid enough to try and build in the area, pottery or arrowheads were found and construction had to halt. There were no digs to investigate further, or at least none that I was ever aware of. I say stupid enough when referring to construction attempts because of local knowledge of the area, especially the swamp. The swamp stretches from the edge of the Fraser property down to the Wannabe Highway, restarting on the other side, and continuing on for maybe another quarter mile. So, in short, a half-mile long, quarter-mile wide, near-solid patch of swamp. You don't mess with the swamp, and nothing in the swamp messes with you. Now, I have to preface my own story with a quick account from my mother. Before I was born, my mother and my father were driving down the road to drop her off at home after a date. They were just about to clear the small span of woods leading up to the swamp when they stopped. There was a man in the middle of the road. Both of my parents swear they saw this man, and then, just as soon as he had appeared, he was gone. Anyways, when I was 14, I was walking down the road with my best friend at the time, Corinne. We had a candlelit lantern to light the way because we couldn't find the flashlight. My mother and I were big into the Renaissance festival scene, so we always had plenty of candles lying around. So it's late at night, midsummer, and Corinne and I are walking in the direction of the swamp. We go around this big turn in the road and she stops. I'm looking out into the Fraser's field, so I don't notice this until she calls out to me. "Britt, stop!" I stop, turn, and see she has also stopped. I will never forget the look on her face. I have never seen her eyes get so wide or her face turn so pale. She pointed past me down the road, and I turned to see what she was pointing at. Standing next to the Fraser mailbox, right across from the beginning of the swamp, was what looked like a man. He was impossibly tall, a good 8 feet, lacked all distinctive features, but was a black, solid mass. The moon shone through the trees, and the light was swallowed up right where he stood. I was terrified. I stood there for what had to have been a few minutes, staring at this figure. It stared back at me. It had no defined eyes, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. It dared me to move closer, and something in me knew that if I took another step, I was not going to be safe. Corinne broke the silence by telling me to run. She started sprinting back towards the trailer, and I followed suit. Neither of us were particularly active girls, so sprinting a half-mile was unthinkable under any other conditions, but we did it. We ran back to my trailer and stumbled through the front door. My mother was awake at her computer, and she looked at us like we'd just lost our minds. We explained that we had seen a man out by the swamp, and her look of confusion and concern shifted to one of grim understanding. She told us to breathe, close the door behind us, and sit down. This was when she told me the story about her, my father, and the man just outside of the swamp. I'm convinced that what Corinne and I saw that night was the same thing my parents had seen. I never walked towards the swamp on my own again, only doing so with my mother and once with my girlfriend who was visiting. On these walks, I never see the man, but even a decade later, I have never been able to drive through the area without feeling like someone or something is watching me until I get safely past the barrier woods. I would like to share one of my experiences, but I'll need to give a bit of backstory and description, so I hope you'll bear with me. This was the first time that I've told anyone about some of this, and even those who were there at the time have never been informed of everything that happened and how I felt. You can call me Alice. I'm over 50, live in the UK, and this is a true story. For about 20 years, I was a member of a reenactment group that was reasonably well known amongst both museum and historical building custodial staff as being properly researched and happy to explain their findings with the public and interested professionals. As such, I have stayed, lived, and worked in several ancient monuments, castles, and battlefields across the south of England and the Welsh borders, and I have been quite comfortable in all of them, with one notable exception. It is this instance I would like to tell you about. The place was Chepstow Castle. Construction for Chepstow Castle started in 1067, and the site was expanded and rebuilt, but by the 1700s had become nothing more than animal storage and was in disrepair. In the 1980s, Cadw, the Welsh Tourist and Heritage Board, was looking for ways to increase the tourist trade to its holdings. As a group, we were requested to occupy the castle on a few occasions, starting in 1995, so we did what we were best at, explaining and educating about life in a medieval castle. In 1997, we were asked to return for a second time. It was miserable. The tents were damp, the wind was howling through the open courtyards, and the skies were a heavy gray that threatened rain. We were having trouble with some of our exhibits, as we were unable to have our usual cooking fires, but soldiered on gamely. As the day progressed, one of the custodians approached our captain and offered the use of the museum for sleeping in. The offer was gratefully accepted, and I was informed that I could sleep there as I had 3 children under the age of 5 in camp with me. After the castle closed for the night and the gates were locked, my kids and I settled down in the museum, setting out sleeping bags and going through the usual bedtime rituals. By about 10, the kids were all asleep. The museum was quite small, with a central glass enclosure that contained relics found on the grounds and mannequins around the edges, displaying the clothing worn at the castle through the centuries. The walls were original stone, apart from a set of windows about 10 inches deep at foot level that let the light in from outside. I can't remember if that was their actual size or if the rest of the panes had been blocked by boarding as backing for the exhibits. Unless you've stayed in a castle for any length of time, you may not know that they breathe. The air flows from one end of the castle to another, rhythmically and regularly, and it is something that we just ignore. Also, there is usually very little light bleed from the nearest town, so unless it's a clear night with a full moon, the castle gets pitch black, so dark that you cannot see your hand in front of your face. Torches are a necessity. I went back out to discuss the following day's itinerary, use the loo, and brush my teeth. Once I was done, I left the other adults. I made my way through the heavy wooden doors to the museum and shut them behind me before changing and sliding into my sleeping spot. I turned out my torch and went to settle down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my shoulders as the museum was fairly warm. It was around 11:30 by now, and it had been a busy day, so sleep came easily. It was still pitch black when I woke up. I wasn't sure what had startled me, but something was not right. I searched blindly for my torch for a minute and checked the kids, but they were fast asleep. Shaking my head at myself, I turned out the torch again and settled back down, listening to the silence and feeling more and more creeped out as I realized that the usual castle breathing had stopped. This is the bit that I've never told anyone. I had the awful feeling that there was something staring at us from what used to be the kitchens through the glass at the bottom of the walls. Whatever it wasn't interested in me, but I felt it wanted my children. The feeling slowly got stronger and stronger and closer and closer. Over 20 years later, the hair on my arms and neck still stands up as I remember that feeling. It is as vivid now as it was at the time. There was no point in screaming. The thick stone walls and heavy wooden doors would have muffled the sound as we were away from the main body of the campsite. I couldn't run to get help. It would have left my children vulnerable to whatever was radiating so much predatory malice. My gut was churning with anxiety. Mustering my courage, I glared at where the feeling was strongest, into the dark window strip nearest to me. "You can't have them," I stated quietly, but firmly, even though I was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane at this point. "You can't have them. They're mine. Go away." The feeling built, and it seemed as if all of the air had been taken out of the little museum. I froze, my muscles refusing to budge as I started to hear something like fingernails picking at the frame of the glass, yet I could still see nothing. I refused to turn on the torch because I really didn't want to see whatever was out there. I could barely breathe. My 18-month-old daughter turned over and sighed in her sleep, and at that moment, the attention turned from me to her, and I could suddenly breathe again. "Go away. You're not wanted here. Go away. We've nothing to do with you. Go away. You cannot harm us. Go away. Go away. Go away." I chanted under my breath, trying to feel confident, protective, and believe in my words. I don't know how long I kept it up for. It could have been minutes or hours. All of a sudden, it was as if something snapped, and the noise and feeling vanished as though it had never been there. The gentle susurrus of the air started again, and the atmosphere lightened until I felt like giggling with relief. I sat up, feeling the air move and staring out into the darkness until gray dawn. I didn't bother trying to get back to sleep, just in case. And that's this experience. Could it have been sleep paralysis? I don't think so, as I was able to sit up, turn on the torch, and check the children. An overactive imagination? Possibly, but why just in this one place and time? I never went back to Chepstow, so I don't know if it would happen again. Do I believe in the paranormal? Yes. They say seeing is believing, and there had been several incidents, especially in my paternal grandparents' home. That is where I got the idea that whatever it was couldn't hurt us, as we were always told as children that there is nothing as can harm you unless you let it. It didn't stop us from regularly being petrified, though. We were taught to question. We were raised with the idea of scientific rigor, but it seems sometimes that science has yet to give reasonable explanations for things that can happen. When this occurred, I was a housewife and mother. These days, I'm just starting a master's in research and anthropology, a subject which has all sorts of interesting explanation for these sorts of events, but nothing truly scientific yet. Lots of people go through a rebellious phase when they are in their teens, and I was no different, except that mine landed me in the county juvenile detention center for a 30-day stint. I was 16 at the time. I prefer not to say what I was in for, only that I was, in fact, guilty, and that I learned a lesson and haven't been in trouble with the law since. I believe this story will explain why. I'd never been in a place like juvie before, so my first day was nerve-wracking. Being searched at intake, putting on clothes that didn't belong to me, and looked like they'd been worn by who knows how many others, being assigned to a pod, or cell block if you prefer, eating a dinner that would gag a hyena. These things were all new to me, and the memory of them is permanently etched into my mind. 9 o'clock eventually rolled around, and we were ordered to go to our cells for the night. I had not been looking forward to this at all. I'm not exactly claustrophobic, but the idea of being locked in a small room and having no say on when I'd exit didn't exactly thrill me. It didn't help that it was really dingy. There was nothing in it but my cot, a toilet, and a sink. The walls and floors were cold and made of concrete. The air was cold as well, and I had only a thin blanket to cover myself with. My mind was racing, and I was uncomfortable. It seemed impossible at first, but I eventually drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, I was jostled awake. I had no idea what was going on, but I felt a presence on my cot, like that of a person laying right next to me. That would have been scary enough, but I then felt what I thought was an arm draping over my body. At that, I sat bolt upright in bed, screaming and kicking the blanket to the floor in the process. But I soon realized that there was no one there. A guard came and rapped on the glass of the tiny window in my cell door. She asked me what the problem was, but there was no way I could tell the truth without sounding unglued. I lied and said something about having a nightmare. She told me to be quiet and go back to sleep, and that she didn't want to hear anything out of me for the rest of the night. But I couldn't go back to sleep. I just sat there on the edge of my cot, now fully fucking awake, and waited for the morning wake-up call to roll around. The next day, I was asked by some of the other girls what I'd been screaming about. I'd already half forgotten the excuse I'd given the guard, so I said I'd woken to a roach crawling on me. A few seemed skeptical, but most of them simply said, "Ew," or "gross," in response. From there, we began the daily routine. First, we walked single file to the cafeteria for breakfast, which was more edible than the previous night's dinner. From there, we went to a classroom for school. It was mostly GED prep type stuff, which sucked since doing well in school had never been an issue for me. In that sense, I guess I was somewhat of an atypical delinquent. But at least I was able to lose myself in the work and forget about what had happened the night before. Evening eventually came, along with a slightly better dinner. 9 o'clock rolled around not long after. By this time I'd managed to somewhat convince myself that I must have dreamed the ghostly encounter. I needed for that to be the case. Jesus, I would have been freaked out by something like that even if I could have run away from it, so you can imagine how much more frightening it was being locked in a cell with nowhere to go. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. The first thing I noticed was that it seemed colder than usual. It was then that I realized my blanket wasn't covering me. I glanced down at the floor, but it wasn't there. Feeling confused, I looked around and saw it, neatly folded and draped on the edge of the sink. Luckily, I didn't scream and piss off the guard again. I didn't dare go over and retrieve it, though. I feared something would happen if I did, although I wasn't sure what that something would be exactly. Once again, I stayed up the rest of the night until morning. It would take hours for me to recount every other unexplainable thing that occurred in that cell after lights out, but every night of my stay was the same. I would awaken to something that scared me so badly I was unable to go back to sleep. I never once got a full night's sleep, and I was always going through the daily routine in a half-awake daze. It was 30 days of pure hell. I definitely learned the value of a good night's rest. I haven't been in trouble with the law since. I know the odds I'd wind up in another haunted jail cell are slim to none, but I'm not taking any chances. I still live with the after effects of that sentence. I'd never had a problem falling asleep or staying asleep prior to juvie, but I've had to deal with chronic insomnia in the years that have followed. In my late 20s now, I rarely manage to get 8 hours of sleep anymore, and I believe this is something I'll be dealing with for the rest of my life. And perhaps that's the point. Maybe whatever was in that cell wanted to leave me with a lasting reminder of why I should do right from now on. If that was the intention, it succeeded. I've been interested in the paranormal for a long time, but it wasn't until my high school years I decided to be a bit more active in my interest, seeking ghosts out and such. Despite all my efforts, I had been unsuccessful until one day when I wasn't even trying. During this time, my grandmother recently suffered a paranoid episode and started to show some advanced signs of dementia. It was decided that she simply couldn't live alone anymore, and since we lived in a small rural town, we were put on a waiting list for a bed in the hospital. So, with nowhere else to go, she naturally had to live with us. There are so many stories I could tell about her sundowner's antics, but they aren't anything paranormal. When this supposedly paranormal incident happened, my grandma was napping and asleep in the room she was staying in while with us. My mom, dad, and I were in the living room, my parents watching TV while I was on my laptop watching YouTube with my headphones on. From where I was sitting, I was facing a window that looked out onto our deck, and my parents were sitting facing the opposite direction of the window. The deck on our house goes all along the side and around to the front of the house, so family and friends never use the front door, but instead walk down along the deck and use the sliding door on the side of the house. From my position, I saw a shadowy silhouette walk past the window across the deck, and I assumed it was a friend of Mom or Dad visiting. It was late in the day, and I could see the sunset out the window I was facing. The deck also had a veranda casting a shadow over it, so at that time of day especially, people look pretty shadowed when they walk by the window. So the fact that all I could see was a shadow and no details didn't alarm me in any way. What did alarm me was when I didn't hear the expected knock or opening of the sliding door. I took my headphones off and looked to my parents, expecting them to be greeting a visitor, but neither of them reacted. Thinking Grandma had escaped to go walk without us noticing, I told my mom and dad that I saw someone walk past the window. Straight away, we had a mini search, Mom checking on Grandma, who was still asleep, me looking out the doors, and Dad walking all around the house. We found no trace of anybody. My mom was actually the first one to suggest it was something paranormal. She knew of my amateur ghost hunting and that I had a Ouija board, which she forbade me to use in the house. She thought maybe I had used it and brought something into the house, but I hadn't. Then my dad suggested that maybe it was Charlie, my past grandfather. My mom's family has a history of seeing past family members around the time that other family members are about to pass. Mom feared that it may be Charlie coming for Grandma. Despite this, Grandma being on my dad's side of the family who haven't had any paranormal experiences. The fact that the shadow figure was moving towards the end of the house my grandma was in, and that Grandpa Charlie's ashes are in an urn in the old house he and Grandma used to live in, which is on the same property our house was built on, we think that it was most likely Charlie. If it was Charlie, he wasn't there to take Grandma into the afterlife, as she is still alive and kicking. She's now doing better with care in the hospital. We think that maybe he just came over to visit her, and that's what I like to think. Dad has suggested I try the Ouija board in the old house and see if I can get a hold of Charlie. I might try that sometime and see what happens, but if my past experience of ghost hunting is anything to go by, you don't go to them, they come to you. If I am psychic, then it is in the most unobtrusive way anyone has ever been psychic. The term is usually associated with people who can see and interact with the spiritual world to the point of having visions of the future, and the description of my semi-useless talent does not include that. I haven't seen a ghost or any other entity yet, but I have seen the future in the most mundane way one can see the future. For example, when I was younger and Blockbuster was still a thing, my father liked to rent movies on the way home from work for us to watch in the evenings. He rented movies that were favorites of mine and some that I had never heard of, and even before he made his decision around 5 o'clock in the Blockbuster, I knew what he was bringing. Usually I knew in the mornings before he had even decided if he was going to Blockbuster or not. That is one of the most easily explained examples of what I have. Other times I can guess which restaurant or meal my family will end up being in or eating at without a margin of error. Sometimes words come into my mind and stay there until they are explained by an event later that day. One summer, the name of a close cousin of mine stayed stuck in my head for weeks and weeks, and didn't go away until the same cousin ended up on my doorstep for a surprise trip planned at the last minute. Yet I knew for almost a month in advance that they were coming. I also get strong feelings of déjà vu in places I have never been before. Most recently, on a trip to New Zealand where I had never visited, I remembered distinctly being in a visitor's center before, down to saying the very same thing about a plaster bunch of hobbits. Those look more like mutated garbage pail kids. It wasn't until I had said this that I was aware of remembering this place. I think these memories must be planted by dreams, as I often dream of places I will visit and movies I will see, without knowing these things have been planned or will be planned in the future. I don't trust my memory as much as I would like to. I'm never sure if some of the little things I remember have happened, or are in the process of happening without my knowledge, or will happen somewhere else, years from now. To the real psychics who have to see the future all of the time, kudos to you for constantly dealing with that disorientation. Finally, sometimes when I am in conversation with someone, I get this strong impression from them. To describe it, it's as if the person blows in my face. It's something I can feel on my skin, and then a thought enters my head, normally in first person. It's anything from a sentence fragment to a word to an emotion to a full sentence. Once I was talking to a former friend and heard in my head, "I hate her," and later found out from another friend that this person had only pretended to befriend me for the sake of convenience. All in all, I'd call this vague talent an unusually strong intuition more than anything else. I'm not psychic, I'm just a tad more attuned to the spiritual, illogical side of the world than the average person. Until last year, I hadn't even really had an event to confirm that weirdly potent intuition. Many bad things happened in 2016. Lots of people died, and certain political events made things very difficult for vulnerable groups of people. My family had a rough year too. The last year of high school was, and I do not exaggerate when I say this, the most painful and drawn-out year of my life. Every moment I had to spend in my classmates' company or under that school's roof was like a needle being pushed deep into muscle tissue. I have known for a long time that I have clinical depression and anxiety, but my little sister was also diagnosed with it and had such a hard time of it, she ended up missing the last month of school. That's the context over, just to give you an idea of the negative frame of mind I was in when the real weirdness started. I find that whenever I am truly unhappy, I am far more open to intuitive experiences. The intuitive experience I had on the tail end of 2016 and the first bit of this year were unusual for being attached to and centered around one person. A friend of mine recently moved house, and from the moment they showed me a picture of the new place, I had a feeling of inexplicable dread whenever I looked at it. The first night I spent there, I couldn't settle. I walked around the rooms with the word diabetes lodged firmly in my head. I left the house with a splitting headache and researched the house in spite of it. The house changed hands 4 times before my friend settled there, and I discovered the second owner was an adult woman living with an infirm mother who died of complications related to her diabetes. She had died in the bathroom on the 2nd floor in the bath. The bath had been swapped out, and I knew this because my friend's family installed an antique, claw-footed monstrosity in place of the fairly modern one that had been there when they moved in. And then I remembered my headache began when I brushed my teeth in the upstairs bathroom that same morning. After that, I tried to stay out of my friend's house. I truly believe there was something strange and ancient festering in the land it was built on. But whatever energy was attached to that place or attached to an object in the house, it followed her outdoors. One morning I asked her if she'd eaten some leftover curry for breakfast because the smell was distinctly on her clothes. She then told me she hadn't had curry at all that week. It became a thing after that she always smelled of curry when I saw her, even when her family stopped eating curry because her father developed stomach ulcers that made eating spicy foods uncomfortable. Then I visited her house for a second time since they'd moved in, and was almost flattened by the smell of curry within the house. I asked some questions and found out that the family who built the house were Japanese immigrants. I suspect what I smelled, and still smell on her sometimes, was the product of a lazy cook in the family. You know, when someone makes a giant batch of chili and eats it slowly for days because they can't be bothered to keep making meals. The second time I was there, I also came away with the name Amy in my head, down to the spelling A-I-M-E-E. And the next day, my friend's Aunt Amy, with the same spelling, was injured in a car crash. I really didn't know of Amy before that, except for seeing her signature on a Christmas card or hearing her speaking with my friend's mother on Skype in the next room. The night after I heard about that, I had a dream. Beyond the sight of crisp white sheets and breathing tubes, I can't remember much else, but I do know that what I saw in my dream was what Aunt Amy wore when I accompanied my friend to visit her while she was still comatose. The aunt died of her injuries 5 days later. In spite of the way it made me feel and the cloying smell of curry that was always thick in the air, noticed only by me, of course, I hung around my friend's house a lot during those 5 days. She didn't want to go see her aunt at the hospital. In fact, she only saw her once before the funeral, and that was the time I visited with her. So, while her family were in and out of the hospital, I stuck around the house to distract her from what was happening, and even slept over twice. Perhaps it was the impending death that made me suddenly so sensitive. That, combined with the sickening energy and uncomfortable atmosphere, gave the house what I can only guess was a strong memory of its former owners. All this brought me as close to seeing a ghost as I have ever been. I said previously that I haven't seen ghosts because I don't think I was seeing ghosts in that house. They were not human, and they were not dead. They were the kind of creatures many people see, the featureless things made of darkness, the tall or hunched humanoids who are silent, save for growling that sounds at the foot of your bed. Many of the true horror stories with a paranormal element concern encounters with these. Mine were benign, as are most of my experiences with the spiritual world, but they were frightening. The first one I saw made no attempt at scaring me or stalking me. I don't think it wanted to hurt me or my friend at all. It was just feeding off the energy within the house, maybe attracted by the fresh death that was about to enter the house with its grieving residents. It was rail thin and just over 6 feet tall. Once, my friend and I were watching a movie in her living room. I got up to get some more snacks from the kitchen and found this thing standing in the open pantry. It had eyes that looked like they were drilled with corkscrews and a slash of a mouth that was probably incapable of forming expressions, just there to allow food and entry into that starved body. When you see something like this, there are two reactions. Firstly, there is the blank terror most people experience, and then there is resignation. Clinical depression probably enabled me to act more calmly because folks with my diagnosis tend to expect the worst. And when you add the dread this house constantly put me in, I was expecting that dread to manifest itself in some way. So I was more relieved than anything to see the thin thing in the pantry. My quarrel with the house might be over and done with. I picked up the snacks from the counter and rejoined my friend. But I was wrong to think that I would finally be at peace in that house. Once the pantry thing showed up, it seemed to be permission for the rest of the stuff to reveal itself to me. My friend had a cat. Disappointingly, it never reacted to the creatures. Either it wasn't interested, or it's one of those rare cats with no sense of the supernatural. When I was letting it into the backyard, I saw a small, hairy thing under the swing set. It was the size of a kindergartner and so hairy that I could barely discern a shape, let alone a face. The hair was brown like bracken and tangled. I watched it for a few minutes. It moved slightly, redistributing its weight on its little arms like a chimp's. Again, I wasn't scared at first, I was just confused. Why didn't the cat see it if cats are supposed to be able to sense weird shit? I briefly considered it was my depression changing into a more sinister illness that caused hallucinations, until the creature moved out from under the swing set and climbed the fence with surprising agility. Presumably it landed in the neighbor's garden because their dog started to freak out. That comforted me. The problem was the cat's, not mine. These things were real, and I would just have to ignore them to help my friend. I would have suggested going to my house instead, but her mother insisted that my friend stay in her own home. I don't know why, but I didn't argue. I just gave my support. Over the next 5 days, I saw a few other things. The pantry thing made another appearance on the front yard. I was shutting the blinds in my friend's bedroom and saw it by the faint sheen of its pale skin, just standing there, staring up at the window. I sensed no malice. It was like a bird watcher checking out a rare cardinal, just curious and harmless. This was very strange to me. In all of the stories I've ever heard about entities like these, their intentions are definitely unpleasant, if not predatory. In my case, the creatures regarded me as if I were another piece of the scenery. They seemed content to just be in and around the house. Another creature was a faceless, pale thing I am tempted to compare to Slender Man. It certainly looked like a cousin that the Germanic monster Slender Man is based on. It was more alarming because it occupied itself by going around the house and peering into windows upstairs and downstairs. There's nothing more alarming than opening a curtain to find a fleshy face level with yours. Somehow, it was worse when it was crouching to stare in the living room window. I had a hard time feeling safe with that thing around, but fortunately for me, its appearances were infrequent and limited to the early morning. If I avoided coming or waking early, then I could avoid it too. There was a shadow that looked like ink and moved like smoke. Thin and slow, it drifted from corner to corner across the ceiling. This was around almost all the time. I saw it every day. One night, I was actually lulled into sleep by watching it move with hypnotic grace, doing laps from the far corner of my friend's bedroom to the light fixtures, then back again. Then there was a limb I assume must have been disembodied. This one was by far the scariest for actually interacting with me. The thing was an arm that reached out from under beds and couches, basically any piece of furniture that was low to the ground or had some crack in between it, a wall or a floor that was too dark to see. It was a normal arm, a healthy arm that looked like it should be attached to a healthy person. The weirdest part was that it was not an unnatural pale color, but a brown color like the arm of an African American or Southern Asian person. I could have accepted a warped limb far easier than I accepted the fact that there was a perfectly normal arm pinching me when I forgot its presence and put my feet on the ground. The first time I encountered it, we were watching a movie on the third day I spent there. I felt a pinch at my ankle and pulled my foot up, expecting to see a spider. Instead, I saw the fingers of that hand disappearing underneath the couch. I ran to the bathroom, threw up, and then carried on with my feet tucked up firmly on the couch. A couple of other times the arm pinched me from the space between a bed's headboard and the wall, or pulled at my hair from the space between the top of a bookshelf and the ceiling. The second times are when I saw it the most clearly, a complete arm tugging away at my hair. Somehow my friend was never around to witness my hair being raised in hanks and tresses, tugged so gently it was almost endearing, then dropped again. There are a few other things that are not really worth describing because I only saw them once out of the corners of my eyes, or keeping the pantry thing company during its nightly vigils on the lawn. The 5 days passed with an agonizing slowness and cost me much sleep, even when I was safe at home. It has been weeks since I left that house, and I never intend to go back. I think what makes this experience worse is that I only saw those creatures during those 5 days, and they never did anything to me. The arm was the only thing that touched me, and even that was tentative and harmless. I wouldn't have been so scared if my enhanced intuition exposed me to murderous things I could fight against, or so I imagine. But nothing attacked me. They acted like mutated pigeons. What notice they took of me was like a bird hoping for a scrap, and that scrap ended up being reciprocated attention when they stared at me, and I stared back at them. If there was a climax or a real sense of fear, then I would have something to heal from. Instead, I have been left with only a feeling of vague repulsion and hate for that house, but only for the house itself. The house that seems to attract strange things. It's the garbage can that draws the raccoons, and I can't hate the raccoons, if you'll permit me to use a bad metaphor. My intuition has returned to its normal strength now, and I doubt I'll ever see anything like those creatures again, especially because I'm never going to set foot in my friend's house again. Either we'll drift apart, or she can come and make herself comfortable where I live. I'm just not sure what to make of this experience. Special thanks to the Patreon family. The names you see on screen are just some of the people who financially contribute to this channel. Whether they are passionate about subscriber story time or the other dark content on this channel, their support cannot be overstated. If you are interested in supporting the channel, information is in the description, but even if you only continue to support by watching, thank you. And, of course, a special thanks to the subscribers who chose to share their stories with us today. I'm going to mispronounce almost all of these, so here we go. Sinum, Madison, Britt, Alice, A. Fields 97, Beck, and Darth Zeta, or Zaida. I don't know, I'm sorry. If you've had a personal terrifying encounter you've had, it can be paranormal or not, please feel free to send it to subscriberstorytime@gmail.com, and your experience might end up in the next subscriber storytime. If you wish to stay anonymous, please mention that in your email. Thank you for watching the video, and most of all for continuing to support me. It's been fun doing these stories more often, so thanks for sending them. And now my throat hurts, and I'm gonna go drink a lot of water. Stay safe, friends, and have a good night.